Georgia, 1847. The sun fell heavy over the fields that year, turning every stalk of cane into a blade of red glass. The air was thick, sweet, and wrong. It was said the soil itself remembered the blood that fed it, that no harvest grew there without a price. The Devlin plantation stood at the heart of that cursed expanse, a mansion of decaying white columns and whispering walls. For most it was simply a relic of old Southern grandeur, but for those who had lived long enough to remember, the Devlin name was one best left unspoken after dark. It was on a Sunday morning when the new governess arrived, a pale young woman from the north named Eleanor Wren. She had come seeking employment and quiet, but found neither. The carriage that bore her from Savannah had broken an axle 5 miles short of the house, forcing her to walk the rest of the way through the endless hush of the fields. The wind moved in soft sighs across the cane, and she swore she heard whispers riding it, voices that seemed to know her name. When at last the manor came into view, it did not appear built by human hands. It rose out of the earth like a bleached skeleton, its shutters half torn, its porch warped from years of heat and silence. The grand staircase outside was littered with dead leaves that had turned black before their time. As she ascended, she noticed the faint outline of handprints on the front door, small ones, as though children had pressed against it from the inside. Lady Margaret Devlin received her with the politeness of an executioner. She was a tall woman draped in mourning silk, her hair pinned too tightly, her eyes cold enough to still the air around her. She smiled without warmth. "We've been expecting you," she said, though Eleanor had not written ahead. The lady's voice carried the smooth authority of someone long accustomed to obedience, and her hands, pale and fine, never stopped trembling. Inside, the house smelled of violets and rot. Oil portraits lined the halls, their eyes following every motion. The Devlin sons were absent away on estate matters, Lady Margaret explained. The servants kept to the shadows, moving like ghosts in uniforms too fine for their station. Eleanor's room was at the far end of the upper corridor, beside a locked door the lady warned her never to open. The keyhole, however, breathed warmth as if a candle burned on the other side, or something alive waited in the dark. The nights were worst. The walls moaned with the slow sigh of settling wood, yet sometimes the sounds formed words. Her candle often flickered blue, and once, she found her Bible open to a page she had not turned, Exodus 25, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children unto the 3rd and 4th generation. The handwriting beneath, in an ink too fresh to be old, read only, "The curse begins in blood." On the 3rd night, Eleanor awoke to the sound of footsteps in the corridor, light, barefoot steps like those of a child. She opened her door to find nothing but the draft of the humid air and the faint scent of molasses. Yet when she returned to bed, she saw fingerprints smeared on her lamp, small, sticky, and red. The next morning, she asked Lady Margaret if there were children on the property. The lady's lips twitched into a smile that never reached her eyes. "Only mine," she said, "but they've been gone for years." Rumors drifted through the servants' quarters, whispers of Lady Margaret's obsession with her lineage, of her refusal to marry beyond her blood. Some claimed she had found a way to preserve her name by other means. Others swore that the sound in the night was not footsteps at all, but breathing, heavy and slow, like something crawling through the vents above the nursery. One afternoon, while tutoring in the small study, Eleanor noticed a family portrait half shrouded by a black veil. She lifted it and froze. The painting was of Lady Margaret seated between 2 young men, her sons handsome and severe. But around their feet, painted faintly as though erased, were children, 4 of them, each with the same pale eyes and high cheekbones as their mistress. They had been almost brushed out of existence, but not completely. Someone had tried to erase them from memory and failed. That evening, a storm rolled over Georgia, drenching the fields and cracking the sky open with fire. The rain beat against the windows like fists. Eleanor dreamt of the portrait, of the painted children opening their eyes. She woke to find her window ajar and muddy footprints across her floor, small, perfect, and leading toward the locked room next door. The door now stood slightly open. From within came a sound too soft to be real, the slow hum of a lullaby sung through a throat long since dead. The melody was old, older than English, older than prayer. She stepped closer, the air thick with perfume and decay. For a moment she thought she saw Lady Margaret standing in the shadows, rocking something in her arms. Then lightning struck and the figure vanished, leaving behind only the whisper that would haunt her for the rest of her days. Blood must remember blood. When morning came, the locked door was sealed again and the footprints were gone. Only the faint scent of molasses remained, sweet and sickening. Eleanor wrote her first letter home that day, though she never managed to send it. It was found years later, brittle and unread at the bottom of her trunk. It ended with a single line written in shaking ink. The children here are not alive, but neither are they dead. They said the Devlin plantation never truly slept, that even when its lamps were out and the shutters drawn tight against the southern wind, something beneath the floorboards kept breathing. To Eleanor Wren, the house began to feel less like a home and more like a living organism, one that watched, remembered, and hungered. The days moved in syruped stillness. The air was thick with the scent of sugar, though the harvest had ended weeks ago. Sometimes she caught the smell strongest near the nursery hall, that same sticky sweetness of molasses that turned her stomach. It clung to the curtains, to her clothes, even to her hair when she brushed it at night. The servants called it the sweet rot. They said it came from the barrels in the cellar where sugar was stored for shipment, but no shipment had left Devlin land since spring. Eleanor's lessons with the few remaining children of the house, distant relatives of the Devlins, brought there for care and became quieter by the day. The children hardly spoke, only stared. Their eyes seemed older than their faces. When she asked one little girl what she dreamed of, the child whispered, "The red field," and would say nothing more. At supper, Lady Margaret ate alone at the far end of the long dining table, a solitary candle trembling between them. She spoke of propriety, of family pride, of the decay of northern morals. But beneath her words there was something else, a tension like a hymn sung in reverse. Eleanor noticed that Lady Margaret never touched her wine. The servants poured it for her, yet the glass was always full when they cleared the table. The staff, though polite, avoided Eleanor after dusk. Once she found the maid Ruth weeping in the scullery, her hands shaking. "Don't go near the nursery at night," Ruth whispered. "They call to you when you sleep." When Eleanor asked who, the girl only crossed herself and muttered, "The ones buried without names." That night, Eleanor lay awake listening. Rain tapped the window panes, and somewhere deep in the house she heard a slow dragging sound, like something being pulled across the floor. Then came the whispering again, faint but unmistakable. A chorus of small voices humming that same lullaby she had heard before. The melody curled through the hallways like smoke. When she lit her candle and opened her door, the music stopped. Only silence remained, heavy, waiting. She began exploring the house by daylight, tracing the architecture with the curiosity of a teacher and the fear of a prisoner. Behind the library, she found a narrow staircase leading down to the root cellar. The air grew colder with each step, and the smell of sweet decay thickened. At the bottom, she found rows of sugar barrels, their lids sealed with wax. One had split open, leaking a dark, viscous syrup across the floor. She dipped her finger in it. It wasn't sugar. It was something darker, thicker. When she wiped it on her handkerchief, the cloth stained crimson. In a corner, she saw a cradle, an empty cradle carved from dark oak and covered in dust. Inside it lay a single lock of pale hair tied with a ribbon, fresh as though placed there that morning. Eleanor stumbled back, her breath short, and in that moment she heard a woman's voice behind her, soft and tender. "You shouldn't be here, dear." She turned, but no one was there. The only movement was the flicker of a lantern swinging gently from a beam, and the faint outline of footprints forming in the dust, leading away from her. She fled the cellar and locked her chamber door. That night she dreamt of Lady Margaret again, sitting in the cradle room feeding something unseen. In the dream, the lady's eyes were black pools and her hands bled sugar. She whispered the same words over and over. Blood must remember blood. The next morning, the house was alive with commotion. One of the servants, a stable boy, had gone missing. His boots were found near the sugar fields, but his body was not. The overseer blamed runaways. Lady Margaret ordered silence. But in the kitchen, Ruth told Eleanor in a trembling voice, "The field took him. The red field always takes one when it's hungry." Later that evening, Eleanor stood on the veranda watching the sunset bleed across the horizon. The cane shimmered gold and crimson, swaying though no wind stirred. She thought she saw figures moving between the rows, small shapes darting, hiding. Then she heard laughter. Children's laughter carried faintly on the humid air. Behind her, the door creaked open. Lady Margaret stepped out, her silhouette sharp against the dying light. "They're playing again," she said quietly. Her voice was calm, almost fond. "Don't mind them, Miss Wren. They only come out when the sun dies." Eleanor turned to face her, but Lady Margaret was already gone, leaving the faint perfume of violets and something far sweeter, the scent of rot disguised as sugar. That night, the lullaby returned closer than ever, and when Eleanor woke she found a child's toy, a carved wooden horse, resting on her pillow. It was damp with something that shimmered dark red in the candlelight. She began to understand then that the Devlin house did not merely remember its sins. It nourished them. It fed them, and in return they never left. And somewhere beneath the floorboards the house was still breathing. By the time autumn came to the red fields of Georgia, the Devlin sons had returned. No one saw their arrival. No carriage was heard on the long dirt road. And yet by dawn 2 horses stood sweating and wild before the manor steps. The servants said the boys, now men, had ridden through the night from the Carolinas. But others whispered they had walked, following the river by moonlight, guided home by something older than blood. Their names were Thomas and Elias Devlin, twins. Though no mirror could have reflected their differences, Thomas, the elder by minutes, carried himself with the rigid discipline of a soldier. Elias moved like a shadow behind him, quieter, slower, his gaze hollow and uncertain. Their faces were pale, drawn by sickness or guilt, and when Lady Margaret met them at the door, neither embraced her. She kissed their foreheads anyway, whispering a phrase Eleanor did not understand. "The circle closes." At supper that night, the family dined together for the first time in years. The long table groaned under the weight of food that no one touched. The sons barely spoke. Lady Margaret's smile trembled as she watched them, her hands clasped too tightly in her lap. The candlelight made her face look carved from wax. Eleanor sat in silence, the outsider, watching the strange reunion unfold like a ritual. When the clock struck 9, Elias rose abruptly, muttered something about the fields, and left. Lady Margaret's expression hardened and she excused herself soon after. Thomas remained, staring into his untouched wine. "You should leave this place, Miss Wren," he said quietly. His voice was hoarse, as though unused for years. "This house, it keeps what it takes." Before she could ask what he meant, he stood and left the room, his shadow long and uneven against the walls. That night, the whispering began again, louder now, more insistent. Eleanor heard footsteps above her ceiling, though her room was on the top floor. She climbed from her bed and pressed her ear to the boards. Faintly, beneath the creak of timber came the sound of children laughing, and another noise, something wet and rhythmic like the beating of a heart. The next morning she found Lady Margaret and her sons in the garden, gathered around the old oak near the house's edge. The soil at its roots was freshly disturbed, as though something had been buried there in the night. Lady Margaret's hands were stained dark but not with earth. When she saw Eleanor, she smiled too sweetly. "We're tending to our roots," she said. "Every family must." Later that day, Eleanor discovered that several of the enslaved workers had vanished. No one spoke of it, but the tension in the air was suffocating. Ruth avoided her gaze entirely. Only one old groundskeeper dared whisper, "The sons came back to feed the field. The house needs them now." Elias began to wander the halls at night, barefoot and trembling. Eleanor glimpsed him once in the corridor, his shirt torn, his eyes unfocused. "She won't let us go," he muttered. She said, "The blood is bound to the land." He lifted his sleeve and showed her a mark, a deep circular scar burned into his wrist, shaped like the Devlin crest. Then, before she could speak, he turned and fled down the staircase into the dark. Thomas grew colder, his politeness mechanical. He spoke to no one except his mother, and even then in hushed tones behind closed doors. The more they spoke, the more the house changed. Shadows grew longer, the air heavier. The portraits on the walls began to peel as if aging overnight. The sweet rot smell grew stronger, seeping from beneath the floorboards. Eleanor tried to pray, but her words felt hollow. Her candle would not stay lit for long. In her journal she wrote, "There is something in this house older than the family. It moves through them like water through roots. I think Lady Margaret has bound her sons to the land, and the land to something unspeakable." On the 7th night after their return, a storm came without warning. The wind howled through the shutters and lightning illuminated the fields like veins of fire. Through the rain, Eleanor saw figures in the cane, dozens of them moving in unison. Their forms pale and half-transparent. Children. Their eyes reflected the stormlight. She fled to the corridor, calling for Ruth, for anyone. Instead, she found Elias standing at the top of the stairs, soaked and wild-eyed. "She's doing it again," he whispered. "She's calling them back." His voice broke. "They're ours, all of them, and we can't undo it." Below, from the grand hall, came the faint hum of a song, Lady Margaret's lullaby, the same melody that had haunted Eleanor's dreams. She crept down the stairs and saw her at the base, standing before the great doors that opened to the field. They swung wide, though no wind moved them. Outside, the rain turned to mist, and figures began to step through. Small, spectral forms with eyes of light and mouths sewn shut. Lady Margaret lifted her hands, trembling, and whispered, "Blood must remember blood." Elias screamed. Thomas fell to his knees. And as the candlelight flickered out, Eleanor saw not for only a heartbeat, the truth. The children in the field bore the faces of both the sons and their mother. When the lightning struck again, they were gone. The doors slammed shut. Only the echo of Lady Margaret's laughter remained low and hollow, swallowed by the house that refused to die. Morning never truly returned to the Devlin estate after the night of the storm. The sky remained the color of dying embers, and the fields exhaled a haze that stung the eyes and sweetened the lungs. The servants refused to leave their quarters, whispering prayers that never left their throats. And though the house stood untouched, it felt hollowed, like something inside it had finally woken up. Eleanor Wren no longer kept track of days. She wrote only by candlelight, her ink shaking with every stroke. The lady had stopped appearing at meals. The sons, too, were rarely seen. The house carried their sounds, a door opening where none should, footsteps pacing the hall above, voices murmuring through the walls. At night, she sometimes heard Thomas shouting, begging someone unseen for forgiveness. Other nights, Elias's sobs echoed from the cellar until dawn. The air itself seemed alive. The scent of sugar had turned acrid, metallic. The cane fields outside were growing too fast, stalks rising inches overnight, curling toward the manor windows like fingers. Ruth told Eleanor in a trembling voice, "The field's feeding again." When asked what that meant, she only said, "You'll know when the ground starts to breathe." One morning, Eleanor went to fetch water and found the well dry. The stones inside glistened with something dark and sticky. Not water, not blood, something in between. That same day, she discovered a trail of small footprints, bare, child-sized, leading from the well to the house's back door. The prints stopped at the nursery door. It was then that she heard it, the faint sound of children humming. But this time, the tune was not the lullaby. It was something older, a low circular chant that made the walls shiver. The nursery had been locked since before her arrival. The lady had forbidden anyone to enter. But now the lock was broken, hanging loose from the latch. Eleanor hesitated, then pushed the door open. The smell hit her first, sweet rot and candle wax. Dust shimmered like pollen in the light that slanted through the shutters. The room was filled with small beds, untouched for years. Dolls sat in neat rows, their glass eyes clouded. A mobile hung above the center crib, turning slowly though there was no wind. Every few seconds it clicked, like the sound of a clock with a broken heart. And then she saw them. Portraits on the wall, nearly hidden behind torn lace drapes. Not painted by any artist she knew. These were done in blood and ash, smeared on the plaster itself. Faces of children, dozens. All with the same sharp features, the Devlin cheekbones, the pale gray eyes. Some bore Lady Margaret's face, softened by youth. Others mirrored the sun's. The paint, or blood, glistened fresh. A low sound filled the room, a groan that came from the walls themselves. The cradle nearest her began to rock on its own. Eleanor stepped back, breath caught in her throat. Something inside the cradle shifted. She forced herself forward and looked. There was no child, only soil. Black, wet soil pulsing faintly as though it were breathing. Buried within it were small white bones arranged in the shape of hands. She stumbled away, and her heel struck something hard. Beneath the crib was a small wooden box. Inside, wrapped in faded linen, lay strands of hair. Some golden, some black, some the reddish hue of sugarcane soil. A note pinned atop the bundle read, "The Lord giveth and the land receiveth. Thus the blood remains." That night, Lady Margaret summoned her. The lady's eyes were sunken, her face pale as moonlight. She sat before the parlor fire, unmoving. "You've been wandering where you shouldn't," she said softly. "Curiosity is a gift, Miss Wren, but some knowledge stains the soul." Eleanor tried to speak, but her voice failed. Lady Margaret continued, her tone gentle and distant. "My family was chosen. The land spoke to us long ago, in a time before the state, before the war, before faith itself. It promised prosperity, so long as the blood never left the soil. Every generation must feed it anew. That is the covenant. That is how we endure." "Those children," Eleanor whispered, her throat dry. Lady Margaret smiled faintly. "Children are blessings, Miss Wren. Even those born in sin can be sanctified when the land claims them." Eleanor fled the room, heart pounding. She hid in her quarters, but the chanting from the nursery grew louder, seeping through the walls. She pressed her palms to her ears, but she could still hear the words. Not in English, older, rolling syllables that seemed to claw at her thoughts. Before dawn, the house shuddered. A deep rumble rolled beneath the floors, and the windows quivered in their frames. From the fields came a glow, soft red, like embers under glass. The servant screamed. Eleanor ran to the veranda. The sugarcane swayed as if alive, and shapes moved between the rows. Small, pale, human-like forms crawling through the mist. They were the children, hundreds of them, and they were digging. Ruth appeared beside her, shaking uncontrollably. "It's happening again," she sobbed. "The harvest of flesh. The land's calling for what's owed." Eleanor turned to her, desperate. "We have to stop it," but Ruth only shook her head. "You can't stop what's already been sown." By sunrise, the red glow had faded. The fields were silent again, but the house smelled stronger, that same sugar and rot. In her journal, Eleanor wrote her final entry for that week. "The Devlins are not cursed by blood. They are the curse. The land does not grow from them. They grow from it." And beneath the last line, written in an unsteady hand not her own, another sentence appeared overnight. "The seed has taken root." There were 63 mirrors in the Devlin house. Some hung crooked on decaying walls, others leaned forgotten in hallways where light never reached. No one remembered who placed them there, or why. But Ruth always said, "They ain't showing what's before them. They showing what's underneath." Eleanor first noticed it on the third day after the red harvest. She was crossing the second-floor corridor when she passed the tall gilt mirror outside Lady Margaret's chambers. A French antique, cracked through its center. For a heartbeat, the reflection did not move with her. The woman in the glass lagged behind, then smiled. A slow, deliberate curve that Eleanor's mouth never made. That night, she covered the mirror with a sheet. By morning, the sheet was gone. The house had changed. Walls seemed to breathe, the floors wept a faint syrup when walked upon. The portrait shifted when left alone. Eleanor wrote constantly now, trying to hold on to reason, to document what she could. Her entries became a rhythm of panic and prayer. The lady does not eat. Elias walks at night talking to things unseen. Thomas has taken to the cellar. He says Father's voice comes from the stones. It was during one of these sleepless nights that she discovered the room that wasn't there before. Behind the east staircase, half concealed by warped paneling, a door had appeared and small, painted the color of bone. It hadn't been there yesterday. She was sure of it. A draft sighed from the crack beneath it, carrying the scent of old perfume and damp silver. She called for Ruth, but no one answered. The house was silent. Eleanor opened the door. The room beyond was circular, lined wall to wall with mirrors. Tall, thin, each framed in tarnished gold. Dozens of them facing one another, reflecting into endless depths. Candles burned in the corners, though she hadn't lit them. In the center of the room stood a single chair. Upon it, a mirror faced upward like an altar. When she stepped inside, the temperature dropped. Her breath came out white. The floor creaked Moyer sighed. In each mirror, she saw herself multiplied infinitely, but one reflection didn't match the rest. Near the back, in the 10th mirror from the right, she was not alone. A man stood behind her, tall, skeletal, dressed in a tattered waistcoat. His face was indistinct, like smoke pressed into glass. His eyes glowed faintly, the color of dying fire. Eleanor turned in terror. No one was there. But when she looked back, the figure in the mirror had moved closer. He raised a hand. Slowly, deliberately. And from somewhere inside the glass, a voice rasped, "You shouldn't have opened the nursery." Eleanor stumbled backward, hitting the door, but it had vanished. The mirrors around her began to vibrate, rippling as if filled with water. The reflections warped. Faces multiplied, melting into one another. She saw the lady, she saw the sons. She saw children, their mouths open in silent screams. The man stepped closer inside the glass, his shape sharpening, his eyes pale gray, like the Devlin's. His mouth curled into a smile that was almost tender. "Blood remembers blood," he whispered, "and mirrors remember faces." He pressed a palm to the inside of the glass. The surface bulged outward like skin stretched too tight. Eleanor screamed. Cracks spread like lightning, and a faint trickle of red ran down the mirror's face, not from her side, but from his. Then the glass stilled. The room was silent again. When she looked closer, he was gone. But now every reflection had changed. In each, she no longer stood alone. Behind every version of herself, the same tall man. Smiling, she fled the mirror room and bolted the door behind her. Hours later, when she returned with Ruth and one of the housemen, the door was gone again, nothing but smooth plaster where it had been. Ruth looked at her with hollow eyes. "You found the old prayer room," she said softly. "What was it for?" Eleanor asked. "To call them," Ruth whispered, "and to keep them looking back." That night, the mirrors across the house began to hum. Each one trembled faintly as though something inside wanted out. Elias screamed in his sleep. Thomas tore every mirror from his room, smashing them until only shards remained. And in the morning, the servants found Lady Margaret sitting before the largest mirror in the parlor, motionless. Her reflection turned slightly toward them, though her body did not move. Eleanor wrote her final note before sleep overtook her. "The house has many eyes, and all of them remember. If the mirrors are windows, then something has started watching from the other side." By late autumn, the sugar cane had turned the color of rusted blood. The air around Devlin Plantation had grown still, not quiet, but listening. The workers said the soil had gone bad. No matter how deep they cut, sap oozed from the stalks like thin red syrup. It clung to their hands, sticky, warm, and impossible to wash away. Eleanor kept to the house then, though the windows never stayed clean. Every morning she found prints on the inside, small like a child's, pressed into the glass. And when the wind came down from the hills, it carried a sound that was not quite human, a low, murmuring sigh that made the canes tremble without wind. Elias was the first to go missing. He had been walking the fields before dawn, searching for the cause of the rot. They found his boots near the irrigation ditch, sunk deep in the red mud. The ground where he'd stood was soft, as if something had pulled him under, but there was no hole, no body, only a faint depression that steamed when touched. Ruth crossed herself and refused to go near the fields again. "The land's got memory," she said, "and it's hungry for its own." The lady seemed unfazed. She no longer spoke much, her voice now little more than a breath. She spent her days sitting near the parlor window, watching the fields with a faint smile. Once Eleanor caught her whispering through the glass, as though answering voices only she could hear. When Eleanor asked what she was saying, the lady replied softly, "They're learning their names." That night, Eleanor dreamt of the fields, endless, swaying, whispering her brother's name again and again until it became a chant. When she awoke, the sound had followed her into waking life. She went to the balcony and saw the sugar cane moving in perfect rhythm, though the air was still. Her name rose from the stalks then, carried by nothing. Eleanor. Eleanor. She ran inside, but the sound only grew louder, bleeding through the walls like moisture. It wasn't just her name now. Others joined, and old names, forgotten ones: Jonah, Mercy, Ruth's boy, Margaret. The house shook, every window fogged with the breath of unseen mouths. At dawn, Ruth found Eleanor outside, barefoot in the fields, her hands pressed into the soil. Her eyes were wide, lips moving without sound. When Ruth dragged her away, she whispered hoarsely, "They're underneath. All of them. The roots are feeding." Ruth tried to leave that night, packing what she could, but the road was gone. The fog had swallowed it whole, and the horses refused to move past the gate. She said the ground trembled when she tried. "It's got hold of this place," she told Eleanor. "Ain't no leaving what's already claimed." Inside, Thomas had taken to muttering scripture. He carved crosses into the door frames until his hands bled. And every morning, more sugarcane appeared, creeping closer to the house, pushing through cracks in the floorboards, through the gaps in the walls. The stalks grew without soil, pale and trembling. On the 12th night, Eleanor woke to the sound of whispering just beyond her room. She opened the door and froze. The hallway was filled with cane, twisting, writhing softly, leaves glistening wet. Between them, faint shapes moved, half seen in the candlelight, faces, eyes, hands pressing out from within the stalks. She heard her brother's voice pleading, then her mother's, then dozens of others blending into one long, unbroken wail. She fled to the parlor. The lady sat waiting by the window, smiling faintly. "You hear them now," she said. "They've taken root. You can't silence what was grown in sin." Eleanor demanded to know what she meant. What sin? Whose blood? The lady turned, her face half in shadow. "Everything born of us was born to feed them," she whispered. "They are ours. Our sons, our daughters, our debt to the soil. And the soil remembers everything." Outside, the cane thrashed like waves in a storm. Lightning split the sky. For a moment, Eleanor saw them clearly. The shapes inside the field, countless and moving, their eyes reflecting fire. By morning, the field was still again. But where the cane had grown closest to the house, faint impressions remained, handprints, faces, as though pressed from beneath. Eleanor wrote one final note before the pages became too warped to hold ink. "The land speaks with voices not its own. The harvest is not of fruit but of blood. If I am buried here, I know what I'll become." By the first frost of 1847, the plantation had turned silent as a graveyard. No sound of workers, no singing from the quarters, no clatter of wagons on the red clay road. Only the wind, low, heavy, and wet, moved through the Devlin land, carrying the scent of rot and iron. The lady kept her vigil by the window as always, her eyes unblinking. The servants who still remained swore she hadn't slept in weeks. Sometimes they heard her pacing the upper halls, murmuring to someone unseen. Other times she could be heard softly humming the old lullabies from the nursery, though the nursery had been locked since before Eleanor was born. Thomas had gone mad. He'd taken to the chapel, barricading himself inside with candles and a shotgun. When Eleanor begged him to come out, he shouted, "They're under the floor." They whisper through the boards, "The roots got tongues." And perhaps he wasn't wrong, for each night, the house creaked as though something vast moved beneath it. A slow, shifting heave that made the glass tremble and the walls sweat red. The mirrors had turned dark. They no longer reflected the living, only faint movement and dim candlelight that flickered even when the flame was still. Eleanor found her courage in ink. She wrote obsessively now, as though words might hold the house together, but each page she filled seemed to anger it further. On the eve of the harvest, Lady Margaret ordered the remaining hands into the fields. "The cane is ripe," she said, her voice thin but commanding. Ruth refused. "That ain't cane no more," she whispered. "That's bone-wearing green." The lady smiled, a fragile, broken thing, "Then I will reap it myself." She walked barefoot into the field, dragging her gown behind her, the fabric soaking red in the dew. The cane bent toward her as she passed, as though bowing to their maker. Eleanor followed, against every warning in her blood. At the heart of the field, where the air shimmered with heat though the night was cold, stood a wide patch of soil that pulsed faintly, rising and falling, like breath. Lady Margaret knelt, pressing her hands into the dirt. The earth opened with a sigh, and the scent that came from below was sweet, too sweet. Eleanor saw faces there. Not corpses, not roots, but faces half-formed in the soil, eyes closed, mouths moving in slow murmurs. Every one of them bore the same mark, the Devlin eyes. The lady whispered to the ground, her voice trembling like a prayer. They are ours. They were never gone. They grow in us and we in them. Then she looked to Eleanor and smiled. You see now, child? The harvest is family. The earth convulsed. Hands or dozens of them burst from the ground, reaching, clawing. The field moved like a sea in storm. Eleanor screamed, pulling her mother away, but the lady did not resist. She only looked at her daughter and said, Don't fight the roots, my love. They only want to come home. The soil swallowed her whole. The ground sealed shut, smooth as before, leaving no trace but the faint scent of sugar and decay. Eleanor ran. The field followed. The stalk swayed violently, whispering her name with every bend. She reached the house, slamming the doors behind her, but the whispering didn't stop. It was inside now, in the walls, in the floor, in her very breath. From the chapel came the sound of gunfire. Then silence. When she forced the door open, she found Thomas on his knees, his eyes open but unseeing. Around him, the crosses he'd carved had begun to bleed. He looked at her once. Voice cracked and distant. It's the blood. Ellie, she planted them in our blood. He fell forward, and from his mouth spilled not words but soil. Eleanor dragged his body to the parlor, but by then the cane had reached the steps. It grew up through the cracks, wrapping around the banister like a serpent. The mirrors began to hum again, their glass trembling with light. And then, from within them, came the reflection of the field. Even with every window shuttered, she could see it. Thousands of faces pressing against the inside of the glass, mouths opening in silent song. She covered every mirror, but one remained, and the one her mother had sat before. In it she saw the lady's reflection smiling, though the chair was empty. The reflection raised a hand and pointed toward Eleanor's stomach. You are the last seed, the reflection whispered. And every seed must grow. The glass cracked down the center, releasing a faint hiss, like breath leaving lungs. Eleanor fell to her knees, clutching her abdomen. Beneath her palms, something stirred. She screamed until her voice was gone. Outside, the fields began to move again. The harvest had begun. By winter's breath, the Devlin house stood half buried in its own silence. The fog no longer came and went. It stayed, thick as milk and heavy as grief. The sugarcane had stopped whispering, but that made it worse somehow. Silence in a cursed place feels like the moment before the scream. Eleanor kept to her mother's journals, turning their pages by candlelight. Though the ink bled and the paper flaked like dried skin, most entries were prayers or apologies. Some were written in a trembling hand, others in no hand she recognized at all. The ground answers what the blood remembers. Children are never lost, only returned to the earth that bore them. Each line felt like a confession carved into the bones of the house. The days folded into one another. Food spoiled within hours. Water turned red at the pump. The remaining servants had fled long ago, leaving only Eleanor, Ruth, and the echoes that refused to die. On the 13th night after the harvest, Ruth woke Eleanor with a trembling hand. Miss Ellie, she whispered, you need to see the yard. They stepped out under a waning moon that barely cut through the fog. The ground had split open in neat, circular cracks, dozens of them, each 6 feet wide, each pulsing faintly as if something beneath was breathing. From the center of each, a low hum rose, a sound too deep for air, like the vibration of a buried bell. Then came the sound of weeping. At first, Eleanor thought it was the wind again. But no, it was children. Soft, fragile sobs rising from beneath the earth. She fell to her knees, pressing her ear to the soil. And there, beneath the ground, she heard it clearly, voices, countless and layered, whispering words she could barely make out. Mother, mother, we are still hungry. Ruth dragged her back, shaking. They ain't yours to answer, child. But Eleanor's heart was pounding with something she could not name. Fear, Yes, but also recognition. That night, she returned alone. The fog had thickened, but the cracks still pulsed. The scent of sugar and blood filled her lungs. She dug with her bare hands until her fingers tore, until her nails struck something soft, not wood, not root, something warm. She pulled harder, and a pale hand emerged from the earth, small and delicate, gripping her wrist with sudden strength. Eleanor screamed, falling back. All around her, the soil shifted. Dozens of hands pushing through, reaching toward the surface. Their skin was the color of clay, their eyes sealed shut, their mouths moving soundlessly. The ground convulsed. The air thickened, and through the fog came a low, rhythmic chant, the same one her mother used to hum. Grow in the blood, sleep in the seed, rise when the soil calls you to feed. The children were not rising to harm. They were returning. The land had remembered its debt. Eleanor stumbled backward, her vision swimming. The lady's reflection flickered in every puddle and windowpane, smiling, watching. You see them now? Her mother's voice whispered from nowhere. They were never dead, only waiting to be born again. The soil cracked open further, and from beneath it came not just children, but full-grown forms, twisted, unfinished things that pulsed like living clay. Their faces changed with every heartbeat. Servant, master, son, mother. All Devlin. All one. The house groaned behind her, its timbers stretching like ribs under pressure. Glass shattered, mirrors screamed with light. The field bent inward toward the house as though the earth itself were folding to swallow it whole. Ruth appeared on the porch, her face streaked with tears. It's the reckoning, she said softly. You can't undo what was buried in sin. Eleanor fell to her knees. The ground trembled, rising beneath her palms. She felt something move beneath, slow, deliberate, as if the land itself was turning in its sleep. Then, through the roar of soil and wind, a voice spoke, deep and resonant, the voice of the plantation itself. Blood must remember blood. The fields ignited, not with flame, but with light, faint, red, and pulsing like the heartbeat of the earth. The forms sank back down slowly as though soothed by the land's breath. The cracks sealed. The whispering ceased. By dawn, the fields were still again. Where the fissures had been, only perfect rows of new cane stood, tall, green, swaying softly. Eleanor stood in the silence, her hands trembling. Ruth touched her shoulder. It's over, she whispered. Eleanor shook her head. No, she said. It's just planted deeper now. When she looked at her reflection in the muddy water, she saw not her face, but her mother's, and behind her, the faint outline of 100 eyes watching from the soil. By the spring of 1848, the Devlin plantation was gone from every map. Travelers spoke of a place swallowed by fog and silence, where even birds refused to land. Locals said the earth there was too rich, too dark, and that if you dug deep enough, the soil bled, but one person remained, Eleanor Devlin. They found her months later, walking the boundary of the old fields, barefoot, humming the same lullaby the lady used to sing. Her eyes were calm, her hands stained with red earth. When the county men questioned her, she only said one thing. The harvest was good this year. No one ever saw Ruth again. Some claim she made it out, carrying with her the journals that would later become known as the Devlin Record. Others said she was taken back into the soil when she tried to leave. The plantation house itself had changed. Where the grand manor once stood, only the upper floors remained visible, the rest sunk halfway into the ground. As though the land had decided to reclaim what it had built, vines of sugarcane grew through every window, pulsing faintly with red veins, and at night when the moon hung low and the fog was thin, passers-by said they could still hear a woman's voice drifting from the fields. Grow in the blood, sleep in the seed, rise when the soil calls you to feed. They said she was still tending the land, not as its mistress, but as its root. The Devlin blood had fed the earth, and in return the earth had taken her. Years later, when the land was sold and plowed anew, the workers unearthed bones and too many to count, their surfaces slick with sap that smelled faintly of sugar. Among them, a locket engraved with the letter E. The overseer who touched it claimed he heard a heartbeat in the ground beneath his boots. He quit the next morning. Since then, nothing has grown right on Devlin soil. The cane sprouts overnight only to wither by noon. The air stays humid even in drought, and on quiet nights the fields ripple, as if something beneath still moves. Some call it a curse. Others call it justice, but the old folk of Georgia still whisper, blood remembers blood, and the Devlins were never buried, they were planted. If you've made it this far into the story of the Devlin plantation, thank you for listening. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more tales like this, and tell us in the comments. Do you think Eleanor Devlin was the last victim of the curse, or the beginning of something still growing beneath Georgia's soil?